Good afternoon, everyone. You're on the Spence webinar on LGPS. We'll just leave it a minute or two for a few more people to join, and then we'll get going. Okay, well let's get cracking. So good afternoon, everyone. My name's Alistair Russell Smith, and I head up the charity and not-for-profit practice at Spence and Partners. We're here today to talk about LGPS and exit credits. Why are we doing this? Well, the funding level of LGPS pension schemes has improved dramatically over the last few years. After years of sort of thinking about exit debts and the cost of getting out of LGPS funds, we're now in a situation where a lot of employers are actually in surplus and potentially can access an exit credit. But there's a consultation that's just closed at the moment in Scotland that might make payment of those exit credits discretionary, whereas at the moment they are guaranteed. So quite an interesting new development potentially coming through there. And it's been in place in England and Wales already, that discretion for some years. So there's learnings from England and Wales and how funds are operating there that we can look at and will look at this afternoon to understand what might happen in Scotland. So to help me with that, there's going to be a few English accents on the webinar this afternoon, drawing on that England and Wales experience. So delighted to be joined by Michael Hales and Ed Curtis from Burgess Salmon. Michael is a partner at Burgess Salmon and heads up their public sector pensions practice, and Ed is a senior associate that specialises in LGPS. Also pleased to be welcomed by my colleague Sean Campbell. Sean works with myself on a lot of LGPS cases. So you've just got up on screen there what we'll be covering today. I won't read through all of that, but there'll be about probably about 40 minutes of content that we'll walk you through this afternoon. You'll see in the ribbon at the top there's a Q&A. So if you've got any questions as we're going through, please just type them into that Q&A. Fear not, those are moderated. They are just coming through to us as presenters, not for everyone to see. So ask whatever you want to ask. We will try and answer those as we go. We'll have some time at the end, or failing that, we can pick up with you afterwards directly. Perhaps just a sort of word of warning, please don't raise hands. We're not really going to be operating that way, and it might be off-putting to other people. So please just use the Q&A instead. My colleague Rebecca Lavender, she's off camera and muted, but she's here and can deal with any tech issues that might arise. So if you're having any problems, just get in touch with Rebecca and she can help you. I think that's all the housekeeping. So let's get going, and we'll get onto that first agenda item, which is just an explanation of what's coming and what's changing in these regulations and the consultation. So Sean, can you explain what's going on there, please?
Yeah, so thanks, Alistair. So just to set the scene, some terminology you may have heard or seen in relation to your liabilities are ongoing, FRS 102, and as we have on screen, cessation. So just a bit of background to each of these. So the ongoing basis used by the scheme in the triennial actuarial valuation is used to calculate the future pension contributions, assuming continuing participation in the scheme. This basis uses a discount rate based on the expected rate of return on assets over the medium to long term in most cases, and this is also the basis for of exit when a guarantee is in place. So FRS 102 is used each year to assess the pension liabilities for accounting purposes and is calculated using a prescribed basis set by the accounting profession. This will use a discount rate based upon good quality bonds on the equivalent duration to your scheme's liabilities. And this is currently likely to be lower than an ongoing assumption, thereby resulting in higher liabilities or a deficit. As this valuation is undertaken each year, the results can be very volatile. Any surplus is only recognisable if it's realisable. Cessation, this is the basis used in your LGPS scheme to calculate your liabilities, assuming you exit from the fund. The discount rate is usually set based on the gilt yield and at the date of exit with no allowance for asset returns above the discount rate. While historically this is being calculated on a gilt basis, this is starting to change, and we'll explain this in a bit more detail later in the presentation. So one further point to note is as employers get closer to an exit, funds tend to move from an ongoing basis to the cessation basis. And the cessation basis is the main basis we'll refer to throughout the presentation in relation to the exit credits and debts. Now, as things stand currently, any surplus calculated on a cessation basis would be payable as an exit credit to the employer. So as illustrated on screen in the example, we are showing a surplus of 3 million. So the fund would pay out an exit credit of 3 million to the employer if they were to exit from their fund just now. However, the Scottish Public Pension Agency opened a consultation on the 10th of May proposing that exit credit payments become a discretion of the fund. And as Alistair already alluded to, this proposal mirrors the position already in place for LGPS funds in England and Wales. Now, it's worth stressing this change was due to come into force in July, but it's since been delayed with a change in political landscape, and the expectation is that this will come into force by the end of the year. Now, we fully expect this to come into force, so this does present a window for any employers considering exit with a credit to do so before it becomes discretionary.
Thanks, Sean, and apologies for moving on the slide a bit soon there. I was hovering over the button and it went forward. So good summary there, Sean, and a clear explanation of what's coming and these surplus payments becoming discretionary. Michael, we've got up on screen here some of the things that the funds need to think about under the regulations in terms of exercising that discretion. Could you just run us through that, please?
Yep, will do. Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. So this slide sets out the factors which a Scottish administering authority would need to consider when determining whether to pay a surplus when the draft regulations come into force. As Sean says, we expect that to be by the end of the year. Now, these factors are set out in the draft regulations, and essentially they mirror the factors which funds in England and Wales have to consider. But just running through the different factors. So firstly, what's the extent of the surplus? So this is going to be a really key factor. But I suppose within this, the questions are how marginal is the surplus? How much has the surplus moved around? And how prudent are the assumptions used to calculate the surplus? So I suppose what we're really looking at there is how confident are we that the surplus is real and robust and sustainable? And also, of course, what's the value of it? Is it a few £1,000 or is it into the millions? And that's likely to influence the overall decision making. Next is what would the level of employer contributions say, or the regulations say, is that funds need to consider the proportion of the surplus which has arisen because of the value of the employer's contributions. So funds are likely to be giving consideration to whether an employer might get out in an exit credit more than they put in. So some funds might potentially look at capping an exit credit at the level of contributions paid in by the employer. Also, consideration is likely to be given to the extent to which an employer has been on risk. So, for example, in an outsourcing situation where an employer has in effect paid no contributions or has paid capped contributions, a fund might consider it reasonable that they do not receive any or all of the surplus, where, for example, they had no risk in relation to deficit payments. Thirdly, funds are legally obliged to consider, but not necessarily to follow, so just to have regard to representations from the employer and potentially, for example, in relation to an outsourcing, the scheme employer that has let the outsourced service. For example, as a flip side to the previous point, if an employer has held all of the risk in relation to their participation in the LGPS and has paid significant deficit repair contributions, it might seem to be legitimate for an employer to expect a surplus payment, which it could be argued is a return of deficit payments, which turned out not to be required. So the employer will have that opportunity to make points like that in representations to the fund, and the fund will need to consider them. Now, the fourth factor is a very broad factor. It just refers to any other relevant factor. So that could really cover everything. But in simple terms, this means that administering authorities should consider relevant factors and disregard irrelevant factors when making a decision. And ultimately, the decision needs to be reasonable and defensible. Now, relevant factors will include those already discussed, such as the level of contributions, the level of surplus, but it might also consider potentially future running costs for the scheme linked to the liability of the withdrawing employer, because they'll need to be administered and paid over time. An irrelevant factor could be where an employer is in dispute with the administering authority completely outside of the pension context, such as a planning dispute. So that for us, we would see that as an irrelevant factor, not relevant to this specific decision that an administering authority has to make in relation to a surplus payment.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Okay, so some fairly wide or widely interpreted requirements that the funds will be considering under those regulations. It'll be interesting to see where they land. Let's just take a couple of questions that have come in. So one on retrospective. So it looks like this is going to come in retrospectively. How would you see that working, Michael? What's your take on that?
So the regulations specifically say that the amendments will not apply to exit credits that have been paid on or after 1st of June 2018 and before when these revised regulations come in. So what that means in practice is that if an exit credit has already been paid prior to these amendments coming into force, they can't be clawed back. But it does give rise to the prospect that if an event giving rise to an exit credit has arisen, so for example, there's been an exit by an employer, but the exit credit or the surplus hasn't been paid out, then these regulations will in principle still capture that position.
Yeah, okay. And there's one more issue on so SPPA are consulting on this. Is this just applying to an SPPA fund, or does it apply to all funds in Scotland? Certainly my take on that is that this is if this comes in, and when it comes in, it's going to be applicable to all the Scottish LGPS funds. So it'll be something across the board in Strathclyde, Lothian, and others.
That would be my take as well, Alistair. Yep.
Yeah. Great. Okay. So that's the regulations and what we're expecting there, and what the funds are going to have to think about when setting policies. Another thing the funds might think about is, as I said at the start, this same requirement has been in force in England and Wales for some years now, and indeed the wording in the regulations in England and Wales is pretty similar to the wording that's proposed in Scotland. So we can look at what's happening in England and Wales and for some learnings as to what might happen in Scotland. So Ed, just looking at those policy decisions first, could you explain what some of these policy decisions we've seen funds taking in England and Wales?
Yes, certainly, Alistair. So yeah, in England and Wales, we've seen administering authorities developing written policies around the payment of exit credits, and we would assume that Scottish funds would do the same if and when the discretion is introduced in Scotland. So these policies tend to include circumstances where funds will not be looking to pay exit credits. So this often includes cases where an employer has not been on funding risk, as Michael explained. So for example, where another employer in the fund has contractually taken on that risk. But we've also seen policies precluding exit credits where participation in the LGPS commenced prior to 2018, which is when exit credits were first introduced. However, in our view, the kind of key point around policies is that funds need to be a bit careful in the way that they apply them, and they shouldn't sort of apply them in a very kind of blind and rigid way. There's a requirement to use their discretion in each case, and to consider other factors relevant to the particular case. And this has been demonstrated in some case law on this in England. So there's a High Court judgment in 2021 that considered the exit credit legislation. And in that case, the judge made some helpful comments around the exercise of the discretion under the regulations. He said, firstly, that the LGPS funds should make a rational and fair application of the legislation and give the words in the regulations their clear meaning. And then secondly, funds should have regard to all the relevant facts that they're aware of in relation to the exit and the participation, and they should consider all of the factors that are relevant that are set out in the regulations. But the judge noted that that none of the factors in the regulations are in themselves conclusive. So therefore, kind of thirdly, as there's no primacy to any single factor, the weight given to relevant factors will always be case specific and depend on the particular facts of a case. So therefore, there shouldn't be ever one factor or set of facts that trumps everything else. So I think really sort of to summarise, the key point around policies is that although we would expect Scottish funds to develop their own written policies, they should still be seen to consider all of the factors that are set out in the regulations and all of the particular facts of around each exit.
Yeah, okay, thank you, thanks, Ed. And just on that 2018 point, because obviously that the funds in England and Wales are sometimes putting that in place as a date by which they may not pay an exit credit if you participated prior to 2018, because that's when the regs changed in England and Wales. Is that the same in Scotland? So we might expect that same date.
Yeah, I think so, because the sort of rationale there is so 2018 was the date that the exit credits were introduced in, and that's across the board. So that's in England, Wales, right, and in Scotland as well. So and then the discretion. So originally in England it was an absolute right, as it is currently in Scotland, and then that was changed in 2020 retrospectively. So it's at that point really from 2020 onwards that we're seeing these policies obviously around, because there wasn't a discretion there before, and so that's where we're seeing English and Welsh funds occasionally bringing in this requirement that it's that pre-2018s, they're not likely to pay an exit credit in relation to. So we could see the same thing happening in Scotland, I think, even though the discretion is being brought in sort of 4 years later, because it's being put in retrospectively. We could see the same thing happening. I think there's one point to raise around that particular sort of policy decision that they might make, which is it sort of makes sense for in the outsourcing scenario where contracting parties just wouldn't have taken into account exit credits pre-2018 because they didn't exist then. But it makes less sense for example, a charity that's been participating within the LGPS for years and years and been taking on funding risk, and there's no guarantee backing it up. For that type of employer, that sort of 2018 cut-off date doesn't really make so much sense. So if a fund was going to kind of rigidly apply a policy, that would likely be kind of challengeable, and they would need to really consider other factors around that sort of exit.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. Okay, and Sean, what about on the sort of actuarial side? What have we seen in England and Wales?
Yeah, so a couple of adjustments that we've seen being applied to refunds in England and Wales are capping the level of any refund or credit payment at the level of contributions that employer has paid into the fund, and also deducting expected future administration and running costs from the refund payments, so reducing the value of any credit payments. What we've started to see in Scotland already in some funds is hardening of the exit basis in a range of different ways, including the use of cessation corridors and risk-based calculations. So if we jump on a slide, we've pulled together an illustrative example of these approaches to hopefully make it easier to follow and understand the approach. So historically, the cessation bases have been based on a gilt approach, where the discount rate has been set in line with gilt yields, as shown in the left-hand column on the screen, with a liability value of 10 million. When gilt yields were low, this placed a high value on liabilities, resulting in higher exit debts. Over the last couple of years, we have seen a sharp rise in interest rates, resulting in materially lower liabilities being calculated on a gilt basis, reducing the value of exit debts and in some cases resulting in an exit credit. Funds have started to change their approach to calculating cessation basis to try and mitigate risk. The funds may be in surplus now, but this may not be the case in the future, where they're trying to take account of in their alternative approaches to calculating cessation positions. So one approach we're seeing a shift towards is funds using risk-based calculations, as illustrated by the middle two columns on screen. They're looking to see what level of funds they need to set aside today to give a 90% or 95% chance of sufficient funds being in place over the next Y number of years. A couple of key things to point out here. Generally speaking, this results in a higher liability than a gilt-based approach, so higher exit debts or lower exit credits, and as illustrated on screen, with liabilities of between 12 and 14 million compared to the 10 million on a gilt basis. The liabilities are also very sensitive to the confidence interval that is used. So as mentioned on the slide, moving from a 95% to 90% could take over 10% off the liabilities and vice versa. So if you were 110% funded on the cessation basis using 90%, then if the fund decides to move to 95%, this could potentially wipe out any exit credit that you may have received. The final column on the right-hand side is an illustration of the cessation corridor approach. This is an evolution of risk-based where a funding corridor is being set. So if the funding level is higher than the lower end and less than the top end of the corridor, no debt will be paid, but also no credit will be paid. You need to have a funding level in excess of the higher end of the corridor before any exit credit will be paid. So in this example, we are showing a lower end of approximately 9 million and a higher end just over 12 million. So to receive any exit credit, you would need to have assets in excess of 12 million. Now, this approach is good if you're underfunded, as it could result in no exit debt or a lower exit debt being payable. The downside is just harder to get an exit credit. Different funds use different actuaries, and the results are heavily reliant on the underlying assumptions. So different actuaries will use different assumptions in the calculation. So 95% probability of success in one fund is likely to not be the same across all the other funds.
Thanks, Sean. And I suppose one point just to draw out as well from this, but although the exit and cessation bases are hardening, just from a sort of market conditions perspective, it's still a pretty attractive looking time to exit in terms of funding levels. So funding levels have improved, haven't they, a lot more than even these hardening of the bases. So the outcome of this in most cases is the surplus is smaller than it was before. It's not a case that it's necessarily pushing you back into deficit on one of these cessation bases. Okay, let's move on. So we've explained the regulations and the consultation and what's coming and how we might see Scottish funds respond to that. We thought we'd just try and bring it to life and sort of close off the presentation by running through 3 different case studies, starting with sort of 2 bookends and then finishing with a sort of grayer one. So this is one of the bookends. An outsourcer. Michael, what would you expect the funds to do in this situation in terms of exercising a discretion?
Okay, so in this example, we've got a £3 million surplus, and the reason the employer was participating in the LGPS in the first place was due to an outsourcing with the local authority. And in our example, we can assume that outsourcing, under that outsourcing contract, pension costs were passed through to the authority. And what we mean here is that whatever the pension contributions were due to the LGPS fund from the employer, essentially these were invoiced back to the authority. So I think in this situation, a refund would be very unlikely, as the employer has not been on risk during its participation in the LGPS. So given the pass-through of pension costs back to the authority, it's in effect had no responsibility for making employer contributions. And again, if we add to our example that, for example, the surplus exceeds the contributions that had been paid in any event, even in a situation where the employer had some risk, you might expect the exit credit to be capped at the level of contributions paid, or potentially capped at the level of deficit repair contributions. So I think that's probably a relatively straightforward example, and what might be a relatively common example in an outsourcing context.
Okie dokie, thank you, Michael. And then Sean, sort of other end of the spectrum, a charity here, fully on risk. What might you expect the fund to do in this scenario?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, this is in complete contrast to the previous slide where the charity is fully on risk. They've participated in the fund for a number of years and have paid substantial deficit contributions historically. So in this case, we would expect the fund to typically pay out on the exit credit of the 3 million illustrated on screen. The charity have been funding the downside risk for a considerable number of years, so they should therefore be able to benefit and receive the upside credit. As I touched on earlier, whilst the charity might get an exit, it's probably still likely to be adjusted for a couple of things we mentioned before, so they still may reduce the credit for future expenses to be taken off, and it also may be capped at the level of contributions that have been paid in the past.
Okay, and then third case study, which is sort of intentionally a bit of a grey area in the middle, so a few more bars on the chart here, but we're talking about a situation which I quite often see. So an employer with a guarantee from the council. We'll come back to what we mean by a guarantee, but that means that that employer only needs to fund the LGPS liabilities on an ongoing basis. So looking at the bars on the left-hand side, they're looking to have 6 million of assets in there to meet those 6 million of ongoing liabilities. And again, an exit debt may only be payable on that ongoing basis. So if there's a deficit on that ongoing basis, so the cessation basis is kind of largely irrelevant in this situation for this employer. But what does this mean if they're actually in surplus? If there's 10 million of assets, say, in this scenario, and that employer is exiting, what sort of exit credit might they expect to get back? You could run arguments that it could be anywhere between, well, get the whole thing back, the 4 million, maybe get the surplus back on a cessation basis, just 2 million, maybe not get anything back because there's some underwriting there. So, Michael, where do you sit on that?
Well, I think on the guarantee and how that plays into the different factors, I suppose the devil's going to be in the detail, because a guarantee can be structured in any number of ways. So one end of the spectrum, you could have a guarantee that essentially is only triggered when the employer fails. So when it's unable to pay, or it's gone insolvent, had some kind of insolvency event. So the guarantee in that situation might be I suppose that the last port of call for an administering authority. And also in an outsourcing context, ultimately, if an outsourced employer, the contractor, can't pay, then the way the regulations work is that the liabilities ultimately come back to the authority that's let the contract. So in some ways, if you've got a guarantee that only applies in a situation where there's an insolvency of the employer, you might say it's not really adding very much to the regulations. And if an employer has to pay the contributions essentially until it becomes insolvent, then you would potentially take the view that it's completely on risk for everything, and the guarantee is just there in the scenario where you've got that insolvency, as I mentioned, so that kind of last resort. So that's one end of the spectrum. Other end of the spectrum could be that on an exit, the guarantor steps in. So it steps in ahead of the employer. So on an exit, potentially it adopts or subsumes the liabilities of that employer, or potentially there's an arrangement whereby the employer leaves on an ongoing basis, or anything in between. And I think at that end of the spectrum, you can see that actually that's interfering with the amount of risk that the employer is actually burdened with. And again, you might expect in that situation that there's less of an argument that the surplus is paid out. So there'll be a multitude of different variations across that. So again, the devil's going to be in the detail, but it is something that would need to be looked at more carefully than just recognising there is a guarantee.
Yeah, so this would be an interesting area, these sorts of situations, wanted to see where the funds land on this and what sort of exit credits, if any, they pay about. We've certainly seen in Scottish funds quite a few cases where of employers with a guarantee, and they've typically, in this example, they have been getting an exit credit back, but it's been at the 2 million level, so on a cessation basis rather than on an ongoing basis. We've had a couple of questions come in actually, which we might just tackle now. So kind of related to some of these transitional situations. So let's just try and take some of these. So a question here about the transitional provision. So in the draft regulation says that exit credits or the discretion won't apply to exit credits that have been paid on or after June 18 and before June 24. So given we're past June 24 now, are we in a situation where the window's gone, or is there still an ability to exit prior to those regulations taking effect?
Should I can just answer that, I think. So
yeah.
I think possibly as the draft regulations are now, that's on the assumption of them coming in or having already come in beginning of July, just gone. So I mean, we would expect that second date to be changed to relate to the date that the regulations actually come into force.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I certainly anecdotally from discussions with some of the funds and seeing, we're working with some of our clients, we are seeing funds still pay exit credits. We had one today come in from one of the Scottish funds paying an exit credit and saying they'll do that. Certainly my understanding of the situation is that until those new regulations come into force, the funds have to operate under the existing regulations, which require them to pay those exit credits if there's a surplus. I guess you might get a situation where some of the funds might sort of delay possibly, but I haven't actually seen that happening yet in practice. And one more related question. So if we have an exit valuation on its way, would we be wrong to wait another year with this potential discretion arriving in Scotland? Sean, I don't know if you'd want to take that one. What do you think? Would employers, do you think they should wait or get on with it?
It's very much, you'll have to assess it on a kind of case by case basis. But I think, as we touched on earlier, with a high interest rate environment, even with the hardening of exit basis, liabilities are now a lot, in most cases, are much lower than they have been for some time, which is resulting in these exit credits or much lower exit debts. So I think if it is something you're still, or you have been considering over the past week, well, it probably is still a good time to go ahead and exit. And as we touched on, there is that kind of window of opportunity to do it now, where before it becomes discretionary, essentially. But I suppose one thing to kind of add to that, which I would mention, is around, you may have seen as well for your funds where with the funds being in surplus just now, you'll have seen a reduction in the contributions that you'll be having to make towards your employee benefits. So on the one hand, this is good for you as employers, as your pension contributions are much cheaper. However, there is the risk in the future that they could considerably rise again. So the reduction in contributions also acts to run off your surplus. Essentially, that's why they've adjusted the contributions. So as I say, on one hand, you've got cheaper contributions, but on the other, it's running off your surplus, which you may be able to access now if you're in that position. So yeah, it's very much something, it's hard to get a definitive answer, but it's very much something you need to consider on a case by case basis, I would say.
Yeah, I think you're right. I'd agree with you. If you wait, you like to think that when the discretion comes in, funds would exercise that discretion in some cases, and some of those examples we've included, like if you're a charity that's fully on risk, but clearly there's no guarantee about that. So if you're in a situation where you think you might be able to do it now, I think it would probably make sense to proceed with that rather than waiting. Okay, let's just move on to top tips. Ed, those top three there are sort of more legal, aren't they? What perhaps you could just run through those.
Yeah, sure, Alistair. So these are top tips for employers thinking about exiting the LGPS. And the first one is relevant to any exit, really. So it's not just in the context of a funding surplus. And the critical first point is really to identify what legal steps need to happen to allow the exit. So we're suggesting undertaking some form of legal due diligence around that. And this is likely to include understanding the basis for the participation in the LGPS and what legal constraints around that might be. So, for example, for employers who inherited staff historically from the public sector, there may be specific legal requirements there for ongoing LGPS participation that would need to be worked through. But also in other cases, there's very likely that there are going to be some legal issues there to consider. And so these legal requirements, will likely be found in a number of different sources. So we've got some examples there on the slide. So firstly, if participation is on an admission agreement basis, then there should be an admission agreement there that may well be relevant. There could be a transfer agreement. So this is a legal agreement which would have given rise to the transfer of staff from the public sector to the private or third sector employer. So that might be there if relevant. And lastly, there's always going to be individual employment contracts to consider, and there's likely to be some form of pension rights contractually found in employment contracts. So we think each of these should sort of be reviewed, and any other kind of relevant legal sources to identify what scope an employer has to exit the LGPS, and if there are any legal hurdles to pass to try to identify these as early on as possible, so that you can plan a route through. So that's the first point. The second point, second and third points are more related specifically to a surplus situation. So if an employer is in surplus and a credit becomes a possibility, so this is assuming the new world where in Scotland exit credits become discretionary. As noted earlier, we'd expect that the Scottish funds will develop exit credit policies. So this could be a standalone document, or it could form part of the funding strategy statement of the fund. But we think it's important, either way, to kind of locate any kind of policy that the fund has on this and to consider this in advance. So it's unlikely that policy is going to specifically cover every possible scenario, but and also, as I said before, funds should not kind of follow policies totally rigidly, but they are likely to indicate the way in which a fund is likely to consider different factors and potentially give a steer as to how it is likely to exercise its discretion around exit credits. And this really feeds into the third point around making representations. So we think employers should give careful thought to any representations which they might want to make to funds around exit credits, having regard specifically to the fund's policy, but also drawing out specific elements of the employer's participation, kind of particular elements which would be helpful to demonstrate why an exit credit should be paid. So, for example, as we've discussed, the level of risk borne by the employer, whether deficit contributions have been paid, and so on. And so funds, they have to consider these representations. There's a requirement under the regulations to do so. So this becomes an important opportunity for an employer to make their case as to why they should receive some of that surplus.
Okay, thank you, Ed. And then sort of the last three items are a few sort of actuarial top tips. So firstly, there does remain an ability under this existing Scottish regulations to get a indicative cessation valuation that is actually transactable and is guaranteed for 90 days. So that's something that's worth considering. It was used a lot when you were looking at exit debts, so you had cost certainty on those debts before proceeding, but it can still be useful now in a surplus world to understand with certainty what exit credit payment you will get back, and 90 days tends to be a sufficient period of time to run the exit process and associated staff consultation. So that's something that's worth thinking about. Definitely worth looking at your affected employees and profiling them. It's often the case that it's a closed group of employees that are in LGPS, and you may well have most of your other staff in DC. Those employees may well be perhaps older than your average workforce, closer to retirement. So do have a look at that workforce, and if there's any win-wins that might be there that can ease the exit. In effect, you need to move those employees out of LGPS into another arrangement for future pension saving. But some of the things you can look at are, for example, funding early retirement strains. So if someone's quite close to retirement, it might be that it's not that expensive to let them retire immediately on an unreduced pension and pay the cost of that. You might look at buying additional deferred pension for people a bit further away from retirement. And then, of course, there's enhanced DC that you might offer as well for a period of time. But also one of the benefits of those 2 points in the brackets there under item 5 is that if you are in a position where your fund is, for whatever reason, isn't paying an exit credit, then you may still well be able to use some of that surplus payment to fund some of those costs directly through the fund. And the last point, just make sure you've understood the implementation costs. It's obviously great if you're in an exit credit position and potentially getting a large payment back from the funds, but you do want to understand the implementation costs. That's advisor costs, actuaries, lawyers, and also on the fund side, the funds will typically charge for production of some of these valuation and exit calculations. So that's us through all our material, and I am conscious of time, but we have got a few more questions. So let's just take a couple of those before we finish up. One on the corridor approach, Sean. So corridor approach seems very convenient to have been developed now while most employers are in surplus. Chances that it would still be used in the event that gilt yields are lower and thus more employers in deficit, but very low, this person thinks. I don't know if you have any views on that, Sean. I guess whilst you're thinking, what one of the thoughts I'd have on that is that I guess it is still not all employers are in a surplus position, and for the ones that remain in a deficit position, it is actually fairly helpful to have that corridor approach and that sort of low end to it. If anything, some of those risk-based approaches are kind of, even worse from an employer perspective because they don't have that range. So if you are more poorly funded, you've got a higher bar to reach to get out at all. Any thoughts from you on that, Sean?
No, I think I would agree in terms of what you're saying, and I suppose even if we're in an interest rate environment just now where interest rates we haven't seen since probably around about 2008. So they would have to go some, the interest rates would have to drop quite significantly, I think, in terms of increasing liabilities back to the level they were before. So as we touched on, there is a benefit, if you are in debt, it results in lower exit debt payments as well as, we talked about the credit side of it as well. So yeah, no, I think I would agree with what you've said there, Alistair.
Okay, and let's just finish up on one last question on partial cessations. Are they still worth looking at? Michael, what's your view on that?
Yeah, I think partial cessations can potentially work well for all parties involved. They're quite fact specific. I suppose what we mean by that is so an employer will be responsible typically for active, deferred and pension liabilities, but it's it's possible to put in place an arrangement whereby the employer exits under, for example, an admission agreement. Where there's a surplus, there's no deficit payable in that situation. The deferred and pension liabilities are then, in principle, fully funded, and the employer's got no responsibility for them. But with a partial cessation, then there's often the carrying on of active member accrual, sometimes under a different admission agreement or different arrangement. And that means that an employer can fund a smaller proportion of liabilities. So sometimes that makes it more manageable going forwards. And sometimes that can work well for a fund as well, because they can ensure that deferred and pension liabilities are fully funded, maybe using some of the surplus, but the risk and exposure for that employer is diminished. So the surplus can give rise to that scenario, and with the right factors being in play, it can work for all parties.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Michael. Let's leave it there. I'm conscious of time. I hope that's been useful and an informative webinar for you all. You will get an email after the event with a recording to this webinar, so feel free to share that with colleagues or contacts if you think it will be useful. And of course, if you've got any extra questions that we didn't manage to get to, I know there's some, well, we'll come back to you, but also if you have any extra ones, just get in touch with any of us and we will pick them up with you. Just leaves me to thank my fellow presenters, Michael, Ed and Sean, and have a good afternoon, everyone. Thank you.